Hi, Kevin Coop here, and this is FaceTime with the Content Guy. So I'd like to suggest that maybe there's a lesson that can be learned from the recent situation in New York City where Amazon decided, basically because there was a lot of local political opposition, not to build part of its HQ2 second headquarters project there. Now listen, I want to be very specific here. I think there's a lesson to be learned by everybody. And I'm saying that because I'm sure there are a lot of morning news beat readers who are sick and tired of this story, and they just don't want to, just as they're sick and tired of all stories about Amazon. But bear with me if you wouldn't mind. As I read all the stories about this, one of the things I kept coming back to was the quote from the great Pete Hamill, one of my favorite writers, one of my favorite journalists, who once said that ideology is a lousy substitute for thought. And it seemed to me as I was reading all the stories about the HQ2 situation is that everybody was falling into ideological patterns and they weren't really thinking about it. For example, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, he actually described Amazon's decision as an abuse of corporate power. And it said that this company just took their ball and went home and confirmed everybody's worst instincts and worst feelings about what corporate America is like. Well, that's a load of crap. I mean, come on, really? It is not an abuse of corporate power for Amazon to say, you know something? If they don't want us, we shouldn't necessarily be there. And if they don't want us, it's going to cost us a lot more time and a lot more money to try and establish our beachhead there. We should go someplace we're actually wanted. That's what they're supposed to do as a corporation. They're actually supposed to be smart about such things. My problem with this situation is that I don't understand how Amazon, or the city for that matter, couldn't see this whole thing coming. This is a city, after all, that, has always resisted the charms of Walmart. Walmart's still not able to open a store in New York City. How did Amazon and politicians at the state and city level not realize that at some level this was going to be a problem for all sorts of reasons? The thing is, what they didn't do, because they didn't think about it, is they didn't tell the story in a compelling way. They didn't lay out the story about why this was actually going to be good for New York in a way that would make sense to an awful lot of people and might break down some of the resistance. And I'll give you a perfect example. It's constantly being referred to, the kind of tax incentives, $3 billion in tax incentives that Amazon was going to get, as corporate welfare, to the point that there have been stories in a lot of papers, like the Wall Street Journal, about how the situation may affect the whole notion of giving tax incentives or corporate welfare to companies in a lot of places. Well, it's not corporate welfare. I think you have to think about it the right way. What this is, if you think about it the right way and do it the right way, it's a public investment in private enterprise that, if it's in a growth-oriented private enterprise, could make sense for the community. Okay, that's how you want to think about it. That's not corporate welfare. And yet, does this mean sometimes government's in the business of picking winners and losers? Yeah, but they're picking the winners and losers based on who can tell the best story about why this is going to be good for the community. That's not a bad thing. I think people have an absolute right to say, geez, we're giving Amazon $3 billion worth of tax incentives, and the subways are in lousy shape, and the bridges are in lousy shape, and the roads are in lousy shape, and the schools are in lousy shape, and affordable housing is increasingly difficult to come by. Why are we giving these kinds of tax incentives out? That's a good question. They should ask that question. The city and Amazon should have had an answer for that. They should have had an answer for why an investment of this sort from the public sector would eventually pay fruit, and why it would make sense and make the city a better place with more resources for everybody, not just a tax incentives that were going to help certain people at certain high levels have more money. Okay, but they didn't tell the story in a compelling way. That doesn't make sense. They lost control of the narrative. Now listen, Amazon's going to survive, New York City's going to survive, but I hope there's a lesson in here for everybody, both in the private and the public sector, is you have to understand why you're doing something. You have to understand the story. You have to understand the narrative, and then you have to tell it in an honest, transparent, and compelling way. And it has to be a story that resonates for everybody, not just for a few people. I think actually people want to hear stories like that. I want to hear, they want to hear stories like that because they want to hear about how their communities are going to improve. They want to hear stories like that because it might actually engender trust in the institutions that they used to trust. But it requires nuance. It requires thought. It does not require people falling back on ideological tropes. Anyway, that's what's on my mind this morning. And as always, I want to hear what's on your mind.